This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 300, ta-da, milestone, entitled Biconscious Feminists Have an Easier Time Finding a Boyfriend. Description. This flyer claims that biconscious feminists, that is, feminists who have had their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, tend to lose their feminist anger at men because they can see that women oppress men too. They lose their gender bias, their anger bias, and hence become more approachable by men, because these biconscious feminists are far less bitchy and a lot nicer towards men. Such women are more likely to have a boyfriend and hence be happier. The flyer itself. Biconscious feminists have an easier time finding a boyfriend, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer is directed more at women, specifically at feminist women, who have a hard time finding a boyfriend because their feminist anger at men, the men's oppression of women, causes potential boyfriends to shy away from their misandrist, male-dumping attitudes towards men. So these feminist women often are forced to live alone, to be manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and lonely. This flyer gives some masculist advice to such women, which benefits the masculist cause as well, as I'll soon explain. A monoconscious feminist has had only her feminist consciousness raised, so she's under the impression that oppression of one gender by the other is a one-way street. So of course she is angry at men and sees men as oppressors, and hence behave negatively towards men, making it almost impossible for her to have a relationship with a man. But women evolved to be dependent on men for their very physical survival. A million years ago or more, the woman who was unable to attract the attention of a man to provide her and her babies with male-hunted meat risked death in times of starvation. So women had built into their DNA the strong desire to attach themselves to a man. Their survival depended on it. There are today millions of monoconscious feminists who are miserable because they feel life is passing them by, because men pass them by, being repelled by feminist misandry, feminist man-dumping, feminist bitchery. But this suffering of the feminazis is avoidable by becoming bi-conscious, that is, having one's feminist and one's masculist consciousness raised, that is, becoming aware of the idea that oppression of one gender by the other is not a one-way street, but a two-way street. That is, that women oppress men just as much, if not more so, than vice versa. For example, with women's financial parasitism, women's man-slavery, Fluffy's financial massacring and destroying the lives of a quarter of married fathers in the fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce courts, the tooth-and-nail hypocritical resistance of the Fluffies to the legislation of the PARA, that's paternity rejection right, which, if passed, would force women to FIP up, in brackets, become FIPs, financially independent persons, pulling their own financial weight and not parasiting off the money in labour of a man. Women's hypergamy, women's red pill behaviour, seeing men as cash machines to be sexploited so that she can have a gullible manslave to pay for her to sit on her fat, parasitic ass in a middle-class house to raise her kids that he pays for. Once these former monoconscious feminists become aware and can sympathise with the anger and hatred of masculists for fluffy parasites and fluffy feminist hypocrites, in brackets, who want equal rights with men but reject equal obligations with men by bothering to get a career-competent education so that they can pull their own financial weight and not parasite off the money of a man. behaving as feminists in the parliaments, but as fluffies in the divorce courts, thus meriting the hatred and contempt of the masculists for fluffy feminist hypocrisy. Once former monoconscious feminists become biconscious, that is, they study masculist ideas and become aware that women oppress men too, then experience shows the masculists that these biconscious feminists tend to lose their anger at men, because they can understand why masculists are so hateful of fluffies and fluffy feminists. They understand the source of masculist anger and often become female masculists as a result. By becoming biconscious, that is, being as familiar with feminist arguments as masculist arguments, they lose their gender bias, their anger bias, because they can understand why men are angry, especially when 1 in 4 of them, as fathers, gets crucified in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts. No culture that financially crucifies a quarter of its fathers can survive. If the current gender status quo continues, there will be a sex war. Bitter, financially crucified men will take up arms and go on a sex war, assassinating the gender politicians who install these highly gender-biased divorce laws, killing thousands of monoconscious feminazi divorce lawyers and judges, and doing the same to far more feminazis in the street. Responsible males, masculist soldiers, will not tolerate that these monoconscious feminazi bitches indirectly wipe out whole populations via the toxicity they have created in the divorce courts, resulting 1 in 4 fathers being financially massacred, which in turn has caused 2/3 of young men under 35 to reject marriage and paternity, because it is such a shitty deal for men, caused by the hated fluffy feminazi hypocrites. Once millions of former monoconscious feminists begin to have an intuitive understanding and feeling for the massive gender injustices committed against men, they will lose their feminist anger. They will then become less misandrist and be more sympathetic towards men, thus making it easier for them to find a boyfriend, instead of repelling him with feminazi venom. Men like women who are emotionally warm, like the way their mothers were to them when they were small. Women evolve to care for their young, because the young have half their genes, whereas the father, the husband, has no genes in common with her. So women evolve to treat men as disposable utilities, providers of resources to her and her kids, so that if her current man loses his ability to provide resources, then she evolved to coldly, quickly, disloyally dump him in favour of a more sexploitable male provider. Men hate being seen by women as cash machines and are deserting marriage in droves. Marriage is seen by the majority of men nowadays in many Western countries as too shitty a deal for men to be worth bothering with. Hence the 70% of young men in countries like the US, Japan, Germany, etc., who refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and go their own way. That is, MGTOWs, MGTOW, men going their own way. So once the above ideas, that is, masculist and MGTOW ideas, are as well known by women as men, then it's to be expected that there'll be millions of female masculists who are sympathetic to men's gender plight and feel morally sympathetic towards masculism. If such female masculists are also feminists, then they will be biconscious. They are capable of seeing that gender politics is about both sexes, that men need liberating too, especially from fluffies and fluffy feminists. These biconscious feminists are then far less likely to be real misandrists, because it will be difficult for them to feel real anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, because they are just as conscious of the many ways women, especially fluffies and fluffy feminists, oppress men, for example, as listed above. So these biconscious feminists will be much calmer, more balanced, less gender biased, less anger biased towards men, and hence be much more approachable by men, thus increasing the odds that these biconscious feminists become capable of attracting a potential boyfriend, and less likely that he will dump her for her feminazi bitchery, because she will have become far less feminazi bitchy. As masculist ideas spread through the culture, if the feminist who is only partially biconscious becomes too monoconscious, pushing her feminist rhetoric onto her boyfriend, then he, being conscious of masculist ideas, can accuse her of being monoconscious, hence gender biased, anger biased, and insufficiently well informed of masculist ideas, so that she needs to do more homework on masculist ideas. Masculists need to educate feminists that it's in the self-interest of feminists to become biconscious so that they can have boyfriends. Otherwise, they may be condemned to live lonely, manless lives and suffer greatly, especially by not being able to have kids. Those monoconscious feminists who choose to be single mothers must then become super moms, juggling two roles, as female careerist and as a single mother of infants at the same time, which is virtually impossible. Such women tend to burn out by the time they are 40. Masculists need to educate other men so that the other men push the idea of biconsciousness onto the women in their lives, so that millions of women lose their monoconscious anger at men and become more gender balanced, less anger biased, and more conscious and less hypocritical of men's gender suffering, especially in the divorce courts, and being manslaves to fluffy parasites. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Brackets contains links to 300 YouTube, Patreon, Minds, BitChute, Masculist essays /videos. Ciao.